Welcome to Clotheshorse, the podcast that will never copy your sweater. I'm your host, Amanda. Today is part 1 of 3 episodes featuring my friend Dani of Picnic. In her career as a sweater designer, otherwise known as knitwear, she worked for several large fast fashion retailers. Now she has her own brand, Picnic, where she makes cool hats out of awesome vintage towels. But she also sells masks, vintage clothes, and she has some other new stuff coming soon. I'll share a link to her Instagram in the show notes. Please check it out. So yeah, this is part 1 of 3 because we had so much to talk about. Today, we'll be focusing on how the fast fashion industry knocks itself off. Yeah, of course, we all know they knock off designers both large and indie all the time, but they also seem to knock themselves off quite a bit too. It's super weird and it's like kind of dumb because how do you look different from Forever 21 if you're copying their stuff, right? So why not just go shop at Forever 21 and not your store, or vice versa? I mean, it's so weird. Something I mentioned in our conversation is Tuesday Basson's 2016 battle with Zara. I thought it might be good for me to elaborate on that just a little bit. I mean, for some of you, this will be a memory refresher, but for others, this might be the first time you're hearing about this. So, Tuesday Basson is an independent artist and designer. She owns Tuesday of California, where you can buy her own slow fashion clothing and a well-curated assortment of gifts from other indie brands. It's great, and I want everything she sells, so check it out. In early 2016, her fans started reaching out to her asking if she had done a collaboration with Zara because Zara was selling almost identical copies of her most popular pin designs, but in patch form. Well, she was not involved in a collab with Zara, nor had she licensed her designs to them. So Basson hired a lawyer and issued a cease and desist letter to Inditex. Inditex is the parent company of Zara, and it also owns Bershka and Pull & Bear, among other brands, but those are the ones you might have heard of. Now, I want to pause for a moment because before I knew how really unfair the world was/is, I would hear stories like this and I would think like, whoa, Tuesday Basson is about to make millions off of Zara. But that's just not how it works. Most indie designers would not have the financial ability to pay a lawyer a couple $1,000s to issue a cease and desist, much less fund any additional legal action. And after a certain point, the legal bills might outweigh any damages the designer might win in the distant future. I mean, lawyers are expensive, so these artists would just have to roll over and move on. Unless maybe they were able to mobilize the power of social media to force some kind of reckoning. But we've seen that most retailers don't really care if a bunch of people on Instagram are angry at them. I mean, there are still brands who haven't hashtag paid up for the orders they canceled on factories this spring. They just don't care unless they're actually losing sales, and they can prove that. There's an actual cause that they can correlate it to. Otherwise, they're going to keep it business as usual, even if that means stealing ideas from artists and other designers. So fortunately, Tuesday Basson was able to hire a lawyer because after she sent the cease and desist letter, she found even more of her designs had been copied by Zara and Bershka. And once again, these were exact copies. I've seen the photos. It's ridiculous. Inditex's response to her letter is pretty infamous in terms of its shittiness, and I'm going to read it to you. It's very, very legalese, but then I'll tell you what it means. So I'm not reading the whole letter, just one paragraph that is the extra shitty part of it. And they say, "We reject your claims here for reasons similar to those already stated above. The lack of distinctiveness of your client's purported designs makes it very hard to see how a significant part of the population anywhere in the world would associate the signs with Tuesday Basson. This is our firm view, and being aware of the third-party notifications that you have brought to our attention. In this last regard, please note that such notifications amount to a handful of complaints only, when it is borne in mind that millions of users worldwide visit the respective websites monthly." And then they said, Zara, 98 million average monthly visits last year. Bershka, 15 million average monthly visits last year. The figures clearly put these notifications into sharp perspective. So, what did that mean? Basically, they're saying, hey, listen, we know you said that people reached out to you about us allegedly copying you, and you have forwarded those messages to us in your cease and desist. But does that really mean anything when you are like so much smaller than us? You're not famous enough to be copied by someone as big as us. It's a total dick move, right? Basson let loose with Zara's letter on Instagram, and it turned into like a social media tidal wave. More and more artists realized that their work had been copied by Zara too. I want to say it was like 20 artists, and it included big names that you might recognize, or at least big to us, like Big Bud Press, Robin Eisenberg, Adam J. Kurtz, Sarah Lyons, and These Are Things. And once again, these were like exact copies. In Inditex's letter, when they say that like Tuesday Basson's work wasn't distinctive enough to be copied, I mean, that's just a bold lie. It became pretty apparent that someone at Zara had just been searching hashtag enamel pins on Instagram and just stole the art. And Zara's later rebuttal after this picked up steam on social media was like, well, we have a really big company. We have many, many, many designers. How could we even know who stole the design? But we'll try to figure it out. Like, that's where they kind of left it. As far as I know, Basson eventually settled with Zara. There's a great episode of Articles of Interest about her battle, and I'll share it in the show notes. She's actually interviewed for it. She was also around the same time copied by Hot Topic. I mean, it's just so widespread. I don't know what happened to the other artists because, once again, smaller artists and designers don't tend to have the spare cash to hire a lawyer to fight on their behalf. So it's really up to us as consumers to advocate for these artists by speaking out to retailers that steal their ideas and give our money to the actual artists while withholding money from the brands that steal. It's the only way we can protect small artists and designers and also support them and let them grow. Because their legal power is so minimal, and we'll get more into the legality of copying in our conversation today, but I gotta say, the law's not really on the side of designers in the United States. So this kind of copying happens all the time, especially to these indie artists because the repercussions are so minimal for the large corporations. PacSun, Forever 21, random Amazon sellers, I mean, tons of other retailers have been caught in the act, and they're kind of like, whatever. They hope that we'll just forget about it and move on. Today, we're going to talk about how these things happen with big retailers that really ought to know better. So let's get into our conversation with Dani. Today, I'm excited to be sitting down with Dani, who is the owner of Picnic, among other endeavors. So, yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, let me begin at my origins. My origin story. So I grew up in Vancouver, Canada. My parents have a business, or they did have a business up until last year. They retired and ended their business. So they started basically in the 70s. I think my parents met at like a rummage sale or something. So my dad had an antique store at the time, and my mom was really into vintage, and she was upcycling basically. So she was, one of the examples of things that she's told me she made was she would get like silk tops, men's silk shirts, and put pin tucks in the shoulders and, sell them to women. And so basically she started selling these items in my dad's antique store, and they got really popular. And so they decided to basically end the antique store, but open up a women's clothing store that was vintage and like upcycled vintage clothing.
That's so ahead of the time.
I know, so cool, right?
It's but really, really cool.
I feel like there was definitely that was happening a lot at the time in the 70s. Like there was this kind of beginning stages of like upcycling, but also just like crafting and people making things by hand. So yeah, I mean, by the time I was born, it had already developed into no longer any vintage. So they were designing and producing At that time, probably about 75%. And then they had some smaller lines also within the store, but they were made domestically. Up until the early 2000s, everything that they designed in-house was made in Canada, except for
Wow.
knitwear, which
Yeah.
we'll talk a little bit about knitwear later. But yeah, that wasn't really something that could be made domestically. Up until, like I said, last year, they had their store, but slowly over time, the whole made in Canada aspect initially was, people said it was very appealing to them, but with the introduction of like Zara, H&M, those types of global brands starting to make their way into Canada, I feel like they just kind of weren't able to keep up.
Mm-hmm.
I think we saw that across the board, but very much so within my parents' small brand. They just, as much as the consumer said they loved that it was made in Canada, they just didn't understand why the price had to be so different.
Right.
So yeah, that's how I kind of started the love of clothing and fashion and vintage. Always had a love of vintage. I was always shopping at thrift stores with my mom and my aunt and my friends and stuff. I applied to FIT, got accepted to FIT, moved to New York City when I was 18. I chose a specialization of knitwear halfway through my degree. We had to choose a specialization, and it was somewhat out of interest. I wasn't necessarily like super passionate at the time. I just was thinking like, I know I want to go into ready to wear. I'm not like an evening wear or intimate apparel designer. And it just felt like the right move to go into to move into knitwear, because I felt like having that kind of special focus definitely couldn't hurt me in my career.
Mm-hmm.
I really did fall in love with knitwear as I got into the program, because it was just so fascinating that you're not just like taking a bolt of fabric and cutting out pattern pieces. You're literally creating the pieces, like the silhouette of the garment at the same time as you're creating the fabric. And that was really fascinating to me, that I was like, it's such a amazing kind of merger of being a textile designer and an apparel designer. So I'll never stop being inspired by knitwear and the endless possibilities. So yeah, that's how things began. And I graduated in the last recession, which was
Oh
cool.
God. I know. I get sad sometimes.
I get two in my lifetime.
I know. I'm like, I can't believe this is going to be my second recession.
Oh my God. Tell me about
Such a bummer.
It's so wild.
I know. Well, lucky us.
Yes, exactly. That was crazy, because that year after I graduated, that summer, I went on one interview. And it was with like a Missy label, and I showed my like fashion school portfolio, and it was like so creative and like colorful and wacky. And they were like, wait, are you sure you want a job here? Like basically was what they were saying. And I was like, yeah, I want a job, So I didn't get that job. But later on, I did get another job. It was an opportunity in Philly, which was crazy to me because I didn't really know anything about Philly, having, moved from Canada. And I just love New York so much. I had this like amazing neighborhood and network in Brooklyn. And so it was really hard for me to leave, but like I knew it was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do because I needed sponsorship. So I otherwise would have had to move back to Canada, where there were even fewer opportunities for me as a designer. Funny how we don't really think about things when we go into school. I mean, obviously I didn't know there was going to be a recession when I started school, but I didn't really think about how hard it would be to like get a job in the US after.
I mean, I think it's totally based on the recession because, obviously I know what company you worked for in Philly.
Yeah.
And we can't say the name here, but they seem to sponsor so many visas right these days.
Yes.
So I do think you came in an era where they were like, I know Canada's not that far away, but they were like, let's bring in people from other countries.
Oh my God, so many glamorous. Brits. There were like so many Brits.
And like in the past few years, it's like Australians.
So interesting.
I do think, it's terrible to come in during recession. And I have worked places that were like, we do not sponsor visas, period.
Right.
Right. So it just depends. But yeah, like what another complicated wrinkle. I'm also realizing you're the first Canadian guest we've had.
Ooh,
Very exciting.
what a novelty.
So international.
Speaking of that, I feel like when I moved to the US, I did not realize how much of a novelty it would be that I was from Canada. Like, people make such a big deal out of it. And I was like, it just blew my mind. I was like, it's not that interesting. I don't come from that far away. It's not that different. You know?
I know. It's true. The first time I went to Canada, which was actually to Vancouver, BC, I was like, this isn't any different than Portland or Seattle. Cleaner, more modern.
Very much cleaner.
Yeah. And like cigarettes and alcohol were really expensive, but like everybody else was like this. It was the same.
Yeah. I mean, there are like nuances that I think after I moved to the US, like I really started to pick up on over time. Like now when I go back home, I feel like an element of culture shock in a weird way. That could be partially like East Coast to West Coast though, too, because I feel like
definitely
there's kind of in Vancouver, there's kind of this like passiveness, whereas like I'm so used to this like East Coast, like, excuse me, you know, like, whereas in Vancouver, it's like, like my husband and I always joke about it because like he gets so annoyed because people like we're just used to people just being like, hey, sorry, can I get by? You know?
It's a West Coast thing, and even more specifically, like a Pacific Northwest thing, I think, because Portland is the same way. And like the traffic there is always caused by people being like, no, you go first. No, you go. No, you go. And so you come to a 4-way stop and everybody's just sitting there awkwardly.
Oh my God, yes.
Even people will like, they will not have a stop sign, but they will stop and let you go first. And it like, when Dustin moved there with me, he was just like, I'm like have road rage constantly like, because so people are so nice. And I was like, oh, I'm just like used to it. I don't think about it. But then we came here and everybody was driving like it was an apocalypse or something.
Oh my God, for sure. Yes. I mean, a few weeks ago, I was like at a crosswalk and I like yelled at cars because I was like walking into the crosswalk and there's like no acknowledgement of what a crosswalk is here. It's like if you see a person there, you stop. Yeah. Like, what do you think a crosswalk is for?
Totally. No, I know it's me too. I feel like I walk less than I ever have in Philly because it's like there's no safe space for a pedestrian.
For sure. It's so true.
It's so true. Anyway, back to your story.
Yes.
So you took a job in Philadelphia.
Yes. So that was like a really amazing experience and horrible at the same time. Like there's definitely the two sides to it. But it was like an incredible learning experience because I was like fresh out of school, had no like real experience. You know, you think you understand things when you're in school, you think you know everything, but really it's just the very, very tip of the iceberg in terms of your education, because most of what I learned was just from being on the ground and learning from people around me. And I had the opportunity to travel overseas, which was incredible. So I hadn't even been at the company for a year yet. And my designer, like the sweater designer, she left. And so I went to Hong Kong with our creative director.
Wow.
Just me and her. So it was really, really cool, but also just like super overwhelming because she was responsible for all knits and sweaters. So because there was no knits designer there, her focus was kind of more on the knits. And I just like basically fit samples, design the next season stuff like on the ground there, work directly with our vendors, which was amazing. Like, I think my relationships with my vendors could never have been so strong if it weren't for all my trips overseas. And that was really, really amazing. And, you know, I still keep in touch with some of those vendors. Yeah, so that was cool. That trip didn't involve any factory visits that first time, but I did plenty of factory visits in my years after that, which were so amazing. You know, and I think being that it was a fast fashion company and most of my career was in fast fashion, we kind of have these assumptions of what those factories look like. And to be honest, like I never witnessed anything really that shocked me or didn't look desirable, but obviously that's very much like because of what I saw on its face. Like, I don't know how long these people were working in the factories.
Right.
There's so many unknowns, but the working conditions from what I could see were really good. And so I was very, very relieved to see that. The only one time when we talk a little bit more about knitwear, maybe the understanding will kind of like, it'll be a little bit more understandable, but in terms of how you put garments together for sweaters is by linking instead of sewing. And so that technique is like literally stitch for stitch has to line up on these little needles. It's very hard to explain to someone without any sort of visuals, but the finer gauge the garment is, the smaller those little loops are that need to match up. So you basically have to have very, very good eyesight for a long time, like looking at something. So for me, it looked like the mostly women who were doing that job were quite young, but I don't know. That was the one thing that kind of like shocked me a little bit, but I talked about it with our vendors and, you know, they can't really say much about that.
So you were worried that they were kids, basically, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, not kids, but I was just like, I just thought that they looked quite young. That was basically the gist of it.
It sounds like such a hard job. Like, it's making my head hurt thinking about having to like squint and line that up.
Oh my God. I mean, I did that in school. We had linking machines and it was like a nightmare. It was not fun. Yeah. So being like a sweater designer, it's tough. It's such a weird like contradiction because I'm like a purist in that I want sweaters to be a particular way. And like, if I see a cut and sewn garment, I'm like, oh, that's not a real sweater, you know? But when it comes down to it, like, I don't know. It's just like, it's tough because like there's the two sides of it. There is another technique though. So what's interesting is that in the world of sweaters, cut and sewing can actually be more expensive because most real sweater factories don't have the actual tools to do cut and sew. So those garments would have to be shipped to another cut and sew factory. So it ends up being more expensive, which is really interesting. But there is another, like kind of a third way called cup seaming. So it's kind of somewhere in between the two. So whenever I could kind of push for cup seaming in my career, especially with finer gauge, I would definitely recommend that because the customer does not know the difference. It's like a little bit of seam allowance is basically the difference, but it still has like a chain stitch look to it. So feels like a real sweater. But yeah, that's getting really into the nuances of it.
So just for the listeners, cut and sew is exactly what it sounds like. It's what you think of when you think of sewing clothes, where you lay out the fabric, you cut out the pieces and you sew them together. And in my career, I have seen this become more and more common in sweaters, which is not how sweaters are generally made. They're knitted. They're like fully fashioned, right? They're completely knitted and not sewn together, which is what Dani's talking about with the linking of the stitches. So I've seen, especially at the lower price point, especially in fast fashion, a lot more cut and sew sweaters, which are like bolts of knitted fabric cut up and sewn together. The quality's just not there. Yeah. They form holes, they pull apart. But it's faster. And if you are doing it in the right factory, it can be so much cheaper.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's a completely different skill set, completely different factory.
Yeah. And there's so many determining factors on whether a sweater should even be cut and sewn to save on price too. Like I said, like depending on whether the factory has the capabilities, but also when it comes to, like you mentioned, the holes, like holes would be much more likely if it was like a chunkier or something like that. Whereas finer gauge, you don't have as much risk. So there's just so many nuances to it for sure.
And I think that's a really good call out. Like the fabrics that can be used for cut and sew sweaters are pretty limited.
Yes.
Like you kind of like, once you start to see a few of them, you can recognize them immediately. That there aren't as many options out there. And you definitely are probably not going to see a chunky or textured knit in a cut and sew.
Because it would just look really bad, honestly.
Yeah, it would be terrible. And it would immediately fall apart.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we are. You are working in Philly.
Yeah.
You're working for this fast fashion retailer. So what happened next?
So I was there for about 4.5 years, I want to say. And then I was just like, I understood that like if I wasn't working at this particular company in Philly, there were not many other opportunities within Philly.
Yep, that is true. I mean, I think changing jobs is all an integral part of like building your career and learning more and becoming better at what you do.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why you see a lot of people in the fashion industry moving around a lot, because it's not like,
Mhm.
unless you're in like a major hub like New York or LA, there's not many opportunities outside of those two regions. So if you
Mhm.
move, you know, to Minneapolis to work for Target, if it doesn't work out for Target for whatever reason, like you're probably going to have to move or figure something else out, maybe a career change or something, you know? So that's definitely been a realization, I think, for a lot of people in the industry. But yeah, so anyways, I had an opportunity. Someone reached out to me in New York. I had been, you know, thinking about moving to New York for a while. My then boyfriend, now husband, had some interest in it too. He was working for the same company as me, but he's a fine artist, so he was interested in pursuing that full time.
Right.
So I got this job in New York, and, you know, I kind of ignored all the red flags that they were showing me. And there were a lot. But I was, you know, hearing that the salary was almost twice what I was making at my current job. And they were basically telling me everything I wanted to hear. And I'm going to say the name of the company because I am more than happy to put them on blast, because I don't want
Okay.
anyone else to work for this company. Who even knows what's happening to them right now? But the company was called Rdg Global, which anyone out there who's not in the industry, most people in the industry probably wouldn't have ever heard of this company before. But they basically did a lot of private label
Mhm.
for, you know, everything from like Burlington Coat Factory to Macy's to Forever 21. So the gamut, like across America.
Mhm.
And they
Mhm.
had like a juniors line and they had a Missy line. And so, you know, my direction when I came in was basically design cute stuff. That was basically
Great.
the overarching direction I got, which is not direction at all.
Right.
They wanted me to continue doing what I did with my last brand. So I was like, all right, I guess I'll try that, which was very hard to do in the scope of the type of company they had. So it was definitely a crazy experience, not having any direction, having used to work for a team that had like a concept and like all that sort of stuff. And they also had very little patience for the development process, which in sweaters is
Ugh.
actually extremely important because, like I
Right.
said before, you're developing the fabric. So every single thing you do to the garment that's affected by the fabric changes the entire garment. So in the world of sweaters, it's really important to develop knit downs is what they're called, but basically you're creating your fabric. So the tension of like how tightly or how loosely you're knitting is very important to determine in the beginning, because every time you change that even slightly, you're basically switching out the fabric.
Right.
So, but there was no development time built into their calendar. So basically, we would have a
Ugh.
yarn, direct them to make the garment, and what we got didn't usually look very good, because that's the nature of developing protos. You've
Mhm.
got to get through, if you don't develop your fabric from the get go, then your first sample is very likely not going to look great and you'll have to tweak it quite a bit to get to your second. But they wanted to see a bang on first proto.
That is delusional.
It's completely delusional. It's wild.
I mean, just for like anybody listening, like anything that's made with yarn. So that's not just sweaters, but like hats,
True.
gloves, scarves. All of that stuff takes twice as long to
Yeah.
develop. It's just how it is. And if you work in the industry, you just know that. And there's no way around it. I mean, I think that's why you see so many bad sweaters
Yeah.
at places that move really fast.
Absolutely. So what I learned really quickly also was that they didn't really need or want sweaters, really, as much as they thought, sorry, not sweaters, designers, as much as they thought they did.
Classic. This is classic to me. I do think I just recorded an episode yesterday about all these like Shein and like the like
Oh,
so
God,
and
don't even get me
I know,
started
I
on
know,
that
I know. But
company.
one thing I said in the episode is the internet is filled with all these like side by side comparisons of like, here's the photo of what I ordered on the site, here's
Yeah.
what I received. And those photos are stolen from other retailers or Instagram people.
Oh yeah, I've seen my things from brands that I work at on
Oh God, me
this
too.
Shein website, and I'm like,
Me
what?
too. Me too.
That's
So
fully taken from the website. Like, doesn't make any sense.
one thing I could say, and I can see this as someone who's worked in this industry for a long time, is I can tell by comparing the differences there that they didn't even try to copy a sample. They tried to copy a photo. So they tried to
Yeah,
get a photo off a website and make that garment. And that's why it looks so different.
yeah,
Like people in this industry believe that you do not need designers. You don't even need to look at physical samples, that you could just copy an idea and everybody will be totally satisfied with the product. And like, we as customers should not be okay with that. Like a designer, it's so important if you want a garment
is integral for sure.
integral. If you want it to look good, feel good, make you feel good,
Yeah,
fit well, like this is a highly skilled job. And I never cease to be amazed by the vendors and even some brands that I have encountered in my career who are 100% are like, we don't need a designer. We're
yeah,
just going to send a photo or buy a sample and
yeah.
send it off.
Yeah, I mean, it just really shows that they don't understand all that goes into the job of a designer. Because it's not just sketching something on paper, there's so many elements of it.
Right. That's what I was just going to say. I know. I know. Like there's
No,
so much more. It's not just a
exactly.
drawing of an outfit.
So at RDG, what I learned and why I say that they didn't really want designers as much as they thought they did is because they were getting by just fine before I got there because their sales reps were shopping the stores, meaning, Zara, H&M, Urban Outfitters, Forever 21, Macy's, all these places. They were purchasing sweaters from those stores, taking them into their offices, removing the labels, putting their own labels in, and then they had like these kind of tags attached at the hem that had a coded system that basically referenced which store it came from.
Oh, this is not unusual, by the way. I've seen this a lot in my career.
I had never even imagined that this was something that had been done. So in the tags that they added on, the code that showed like, okay, so this sweater was from Forever 21. The reason why they did that is because when Forever 21 came to their office to shop their lines, they needed to make sure that they weren't showing a Forever 21 sample that had been purchased from the store yesterday to them.
So this has happened to me in all categories of buying that I've worked in. In the beginning, I worked in shoes. I went to a showroom and they had like a whole wall of all the things they can make. And this was totally like, what they call a Garmentos sort of situation where it was like they were selling to Forever 21, they were selling Macy's, everyone. And there were shoes on the wall that I had developed and they were trying to basically sell them to
Yeah.
Forever 21. And we would bust this all the time. One time they accidentally sent me samples of shoes that I had developed and was buying, and they had Forever 21 labels sewn into them because they were also selling them to Forever 21, even though I had created the style. And years later, same situation with gloves. I went to a vendor. A glove I had developed was on the wall with the tags cut out. And I was like, hey, why is this here? This is ours. This is our property. So I did some research because I was like, what is the real legality around stealing people's ideas, right? Because it's so, like, I cannot emphasize enough how widespread this is. I mean, it is happening way more than you think. I mean, like Dani's story alone illustrates that, like, this is literally happening every day. And so I was like, what is the deal with copywriting fashion? Like, how much can you get away with? And honestly, you can get away with a lot. So
Yeah.
in the US, anything that is functional or has a physical function in the real world cannot be copyrighted. So you can copyright an idea, a slogan, a piece of art because they don't have a physical functional use. But more than a century ago, the US Copyright Office decided that all fashion is functional, no matter how wild or what the end use is. So
Mm.
from jeans to ball gowns to sweaters to gloves, even shoes, this means no apparel can be copyrighted. But there are some elements of the fashion industry that can be copyrighted, which can kind of be woven into a case or a cease and desist order. So, one is jewelry, because
Mm.
the Copyright Office has decreed that jewelry has no real functional purpose. It's merely ornamental. And that can be extended. I was reading, like, if you have a really elaborate clasp on a purse that is unique to your brand, you can copyright that.
Oh,
And if
wow.
people copy that, you could sue them. What the outcome would be is not necessarily what you're hoping for, but it could happen. The two-dimensional aspects of clothing, though, are copyrightable. So fabric prints, that's usually
Hmm.
like, if you're going to have a case at all, this is where you're going to get it. Jacquard weaves
Yeah.
and lace patterns are also part of that. I would assume to a certain extent, some knitwear would then qualify for that, depending on the stitch.
Yeah. Anytime there's like a pattern or like an artwork on it. So like a jacquard or an intarsia. Those are the two like technical words for how those
Mhm.
patterns are created. Yes, they can be, or a stripe even, they can be copyrighted.
That makes sense. But that said, I have been in meetings my entire career where I go into a meeting to look at sweaters, and there's sweaters hanging on the wall, and half of them are bought samples that have not even been designed or developed by the in-house design team. They are going to
Right.
try to copy them. And that's
Yeah.
so this is very widespread, goes on all the time. And why is that? I mean, because it's really, really hard and expensive to even win a case. And if you're a smaller
Mm.
designer, you don't have the money to retain a lawyer and get an outcome. Like, it's always a huge win when you see someone like Tuesday Bassin win against Zara or
Yeah.
get some sort of settlement. We look to the law to protect people from knockoffs, but it's just not there, right? We're really talking about the difference between what's wrong legally and what's wrong ethically. So
Yeah.
it's not illegal to copy someone's design, but it's super unethical. It's not also illegal to sleep with your friend's boyfriend, but it's super fucked up, right? So,
That's a really good analogy.
right, right. Yeah. So I think it's like really silly for us as consumers to be like, no, we're going to respect the word of the law here. And if the law says it's okay to copy someone's
Right.
designs, then I'm going to buy it. No, it's up to us as customers to hold the brands that knock off other designers accountable from an ethical standpoint,
Yeah.
because the law is not going to do anything about it. So, like, we need to call them out on social media. We need to not buy their stuff.
I was just going to say, just like in social media, if, your best friend slept with your boyfriend, you're going to put them on blast on the internet. So let's do the
Right.
same when that happens in the industry. That's why I love, accounts like Diet Prada who are calling this
Hmm.
shit out. So like, even though that small brand might not be able to take legal action, hopefully, if Diet Prada writes about them or something, they're just going to reap the benefits of this horrible thing happening, because people are just going to be like, I want to go out of my way to support this brand that just got fucked over by this huge design company or retailer or whatever for knocking them off.
Right. Like, it's only us, the consumers and the customers, are going to be able to change anything or hold
Mm-hmm.
anyone accountable, because the likelihood of a designer winning this case and winning any sort of rewards that help them down the road is so slim. Copyright lawyers are so expensive. These big companies they have permanent staff counsel. They're going to go
Mm-hmm.
at you hard. They don't care. I remember when all that stuff went down with Tuesday Bassin and Zara. Zara basically sent her a letter that was like, "What? We're so big. What are you going to do about it?" And I was like,
It's just like a full bully, like a full on definition of a bully. Like,
"Yeah, yeah." And you know what? I mean, they're right. It sucks. It sucks. And so we need to make those decisions, and we need to hold the brands accountable. And
yeah.
I guess, like, social media is one great way to do it. Some companies, as you and I were talking about before we recorded, some companies care about what their customers think more than others. It's kind of
Yes.
interesting how some are like, whatever, I'll just keep ignoring. But
Some
others,
build their brand based on not caring. Like that's part of their DNA. It's like, oh yeah, we don't care.
yeah, we just are in it for the hard cash,
Yeah.
right? And I think those brands, the only thing that they care about is the bottom line. So if you stop buying stuff from them, they are going to feel the hurt eventually and have to change their ways. And I know like there's a lot of conversation out there about like boycotting brands and how
Mm.
that can hurt the most vulnerable garment workers. But I also say like more brands and retailers than not do not give a fuck about your social media call outs. You need to do
Yeah.
both. You need to
Yeah.
back it up by not buying stuff.
This brings up such a good point because I feel like there's this misnomer that as a designer working for these brands, you have a voice.
I mean, I'm also just going to say it's the same thing as a buyer.
Yeah, no, for sure. For sure. It just basically like saying that like being on the inside of these brands, I feel like people on the outside think, well, you have a responsibility. You have a voice. You can say something. But the reality of being on the quote inside is so not like that. Like that's just not, it does not feel like you have a voice and you can speak up about these things and you can make a difference. It really doesn't. I mean, there is something to be said for that. Like, you know, speaking up about things, absolutely. Like if enough people are doing it, hopefully it will make a change. But at the end of the day, like you said, money talks. So it's like if the customer is still buying it, then they're going to keep doing it. And there is this kind of mentality in the industry and design that like if you're not willing to do it, well, there's people waiting at the door for your job so they can come in and do it for us. You know, so and that's like kind of sentiment like kind of extends through so much of the job of being a designer or like in the industry in general is this feeling of like, you know, you should be so lucky that you have this job. And it's terrible.
It's like every person that I talk to in this industry is like, yeah, and then this person from the executive team came in and made me do this thing
Yep.
that I thought was a really bad idea as an experienced professional. And I mean, we've all been there. I've seen myself have to give in on these things and then see it affect me adversely down the road because it wasn't the right decision and I knew it wasn't. You know, I'm getting my review and any promotions based on how my business is performing.
Yeah.
I've cited the straw fedora nightmare. I mean, like most of the people I've worked with in my career are great people who only want to do good things, and they certainly do not want to copy someone else's work. But their power is pretty limited when it comes to making those kinds of decisions. And I mean, you and I talked about this when we were prepping for this episode. I've had so many times I'm sitting at my desk and like a magazine tear appears in front of me and it's like, make this. Like so many times, almost everywhere I've worked.
So I have a phrase for that, which I learned at the last job. I don't know where this phrase came from, but those were called JFDIs. Just fucking do it.
Yeah.
So my boss then would pass me that tear and say, sketch this, it's a JFDI. And I'd be like, got it, noted. Like there was no question around it. What that meant is it came from someone so high up that it doesn't really matter what you think of it, whether you like it, whether you think it's going to sell, whether you're okay with copying something, just fucking do it.
Yeah.
So, and that is like, I mean, I just thinking about that term like makes me shake because it's just like what a nightmare as a designer or as a merchant, you know, same difference.
Well,
because
if you're just like a creative person who takes pride in your work, the last thing you want to do is copy someone else's work. mean, that's
Yeah.
terrible.
For sure. And the crazy thing about it also is, like, at that brand where I learned that term, we actually had like a really intensive legal department, and the design team were constantly having to take these classes about copywriting and about copying things in general. We had different like theories or analogies to kind of understand or decide for ourselves whether it was too close to the original or not. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we had this like bus stop theory. Like, if you saw the person at the bus stop, two people standing there, would you think they were the same sweater or whatever? Or it's like the blink test, at a blink of an eye, does it look the same? And these were kind of like determining factors of whether it was too close to the original. Meanwhile,
And
we're
this is
getting these,
hilarious.
yeah, because then we're getting these JFDIs. So they're putting all this pressure on us to make these calls, yet we get these JFDIs that we have no say over. So it's like, I mean, it's just such a weird, like, being pulled in all these directions as a designer. It's like you never can make the right choice, basically, is what you're being set up for.
Basically. And so in my experience, when I get these tears thrown on my desk and then I have to go get it made, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to try to change it because obviously it's like totally possibly not illegal, but definitely unethical to copy
Yes.
this thing. So I bring the sample in, and it probably looks okay. But once again, we're talking about trying to change someone else's idea into something that
looks
isn't
like
the
it
same.
wasn't their idea, but your idea.
Yeah, exactly. Which is like, when you say it out loud, it sounds so ridiculous.
Yeah.
But once again, this is literally what we're being asked to do in our jobs. So you get the sample in and you show it to the people who put the photo on your desk in the first place. And they're like, it's just not the same. Like, what I'd really like it to be is like blah, 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 blah. And you're like, oh, you mean exactly like
Yeah.
the original inspiration? And they're like, yeah. And then you're like, no, like, we can't do that. And so inevitably, either you go back to the drawing board and exactly copy the inspiration, or you just drop it altogether because it's just there. It's never going to be successful. But once
Right.
again, like, this is still happening every day, everywhere. Like,
Yeah.
I cannot emphasize that enough. And, sometimes this is an accident, right? Because I do feel like, we're all sort of like breathing in the same air. And so we'll all be like all at once really into, tie-dye or something. But
Right.
more often than not, it is not an accident. And
No.
I mean, I have like you were saying how you've gone you've seen a sales rep literally trying to sell stuff you made at a different job.
Yes. The same company who's like not happy with the protos I'm bringing in, yet they're bringing things in from the brand I last worked at and putting it on the wall and saying like, why can't you design stuff like this?
I know.
I'm like, you mean the thing I designed?
It's such a crazy idea. Like, if you're someone like Rdg Global, who, by the way, the Glassdoor reviews are such a red flag.
Yep.
Like, I say this a lot. I'm going to say it again. If you haven't heard me say this before you interview for a job, read the Glassdoor reviews. Like, they are doing it's all the classic tropes I've come to recognize from a toxic culture, which is really fucking brutal reviews of people having a terrible time working there. Each one followed by a 5-star, I can't even say anything that is wrong with this company kind of review. Like, that means
if you
like,
can't see through that, then like you probably should go work for Rdg Global.
Yeah, I mean, like, take 5 minutes and go through these, because I would say, based on my experience, working for various different companies of different degrees of terribleness, if you see a couple bad reviews and then some okay reviews, then it's probably
pretty legit.
It's pretty legit. Some people have a bad experience, some people don't. If you see a really extreme mix of very dark reviews and extremely, like, this is the best place to work ever reviews, that place is super toxic. And at some point, the boss there made everyone write a fake glowing review. And this happens everywhere that's shitty. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Anyway, so back to, like, this idea of copying stuff. When you're like a private label retailer, which means you're making stuff for other brands and they're putting their labels in it, like, your accountability is going to be a lot lower, I guess I would say, like, from like a social perspective. But when you're a retailer and you do that and you get known for doing that, which I've worked places that are known for that, suddenly nice, cool designers and brands will not sell to you anymore. And I think I was telling you
Mm,
when you and I were working on this episode plan about when I was working in shoes, we went to see this like small indie, like upscale shoe designer because the executive team had come to us and said, like, listen, we want you to put these like high end shoe assortments in like 10 doors and it'll like, it'll elevate our brand as a whole.
yeah.
And then we can put them in the catalog too, and it'll make the catalog more premium. So we're doing the rounds of all these fancy brands of shoes. And I'm talking like, $3, $4, $5, $600 shoes, which we were a place that sold like $50 shoes. So this is a big shift. And
Yeah.
it was tough. We would have to like persuade these people to sell to us. Like they just were like, you're an asshole. You copy stuff. You're known for copying stuff. How do I know if I don't sell you these shoes next week, you're not going to make your own version of it? And it's like, touche, like you're right. And we went to see this one brand and the owner, like, I don't know. I think she just wanted to be mean to someone. She knew she wasn't going to sell to us, but she still set up the appointment and had us come in and immediately just lit into us about what terrible people we were and how did we sleep at night. And there was no way she would sell to us ever because we were these monsters who copy shit. And, it's not like I could step in and be like, well, it's like way more complicated than that, right? Like we don't do this by choice. I mean, she was right to a certain extent. And so basically, like if you're a retailer and you continue to copy stuff, even if your customers don't hold you accountable, which as you and I've talked about, it just doesn't happen as much as we'd like, brands are going to start to hold you accountable and punish you in these other ways, deservingly so.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just so unethical.
It really is. And like you said, I feel like within these brands where they're responsible for this copying, like you said, a lot of the times they don't even really perhaps know because they're buying from outside vendors. But as much as we want to say like, okay, we can't take responsibility, we didn't know, there should be systems in place for these brands where they can make sure that kind of stuff doesn't happen because,
100%,
like
100%
exactly
agree.
like I feel like there could be entire departments within these brands that are, combing the web, like maybe you went to this amazing meeting, you met with these reps, they showed you this amazing necklace and you're like, I really, really want to buy this necklace. We're going to place like a 10,000 unit buy on this. You have to send it through this, new type of team that will comb the web. See, did somebody make that necklace on Etsy? Did that vendor rip that off from someone else? And hold the vendors responsible. I think at the last brand I worked at, they actually did have better systems in place for that sort of stuff, which is ironic because it's the same as the JFDI company. But they would make sure that when they were buying something from outside vendors, or even if it was their in-house vendors providing them with ideas, they basically had to sign something that said that this is our own idea. We didn't steal it from someone else, so that if there were legal matters later, they would have to pay the fines.
And that's so smart because I know which place you're talking about, and I've never seen a single article saying they copied something. So it's possible. And I was telling you before about a place I worked. We had this necklace. It was like a state with a heart. I mean, to be honest, something that's like been all over the internet for a long time, but this was the first time the buyer had seen it. She saw it at a vendor showroom hanging on the wall. It's starting to sound exactly like the kind of place that you worked, right? And so there's tons of these. I mean, there's so many of these kinds of vendors, more than not. Once again, when you see something with a label on it for a retailer or brand, that doesn't necessarily mean that they designed it at all. It just means someone made it and put that label in. So with jewelry, like the place I worked, we obviously didn't have our own jewelry design team. We didn't have a jewelry factory. We would go to market and buy from other vendors, and then it would like have our hang tag on it, right? And they bought this necklace. It blew up the internet. It was like, you copied this from this Etsy person, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, what had happened is that the vendor had bought it from Etsy, hung it on the wall, and was like, someone's going to buy it. And, we did.
Right.
But you can't explain, to explain that to a customer. Well, honestly, I feel like they should have, because this is happening all the time. The Etsy person should have been suing that vendor because who knows who else that vendor sold it to.
Yeah.
And instead, it was like they were coming after the retailer. But once again, like Danny's saying, there should be someone whose job is to just check that stuff.
Yeah.
Spend the money.
It's not that hard.
But, like retailers just don't care. They're like, whatever.
No, they don't.
They just don't care.
They really don't. And to be honest, like there is an element that I do understand, not saying it's right, but the way things move within these brands is so fast paced. It's like,
oh my God,
you can't even catch up with what is wanted of you and expected, because it's just like, you could be designing this line and everyone be happy with it. And then like all of a sudden we have a meeting and blah, blah, blah says this about that. And blah, blah says this about that. And all of a sudden overnight, the line is flipped. We have to place orders tomorrow. They're starting to order the yarn. Like it's already knitting, it's like happens so fast. So like to think that there needs to be this protocol within there where someone's also checking and making sure that we're not like ripping someone off, it's kind of unfathomable with how things are going right now.
Oh, for
Very
sure.
much hope that changes. I hope that many things in the fashion industry changes. But to think of that, the reality of that is kind of hard to imagine.
It is. I mean, how it is right now. I mean, I've seen in the length of my career this entire shift in like things speeding up where suddenly we have to deliver new product like every day.
Like tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah. And
yesterday.
Like, we can't, like, in the beginning of my career, I would be working on product that wasn't going to deliver for like 6 months, especially when we were talking about yarn stuff. Like if I was doing scarves and gloves, I would be working like, right now it's like it's September. I would be working on like next summer, whatever that might be. And now it's shifted. I mean, this kind of happened gradually and now it's so crazy that like a lot of buyers right now in September are like placing orders for things that are going to deliver in November.
It's wild.
It's so wild.
It's so wild. It's crazy. I mean,
yeah.
And it's interesting because you've talked a lot about like what the pandemic has done to the industry. And like, I think that there were obviously very immediate effects because all of a sudden people either A, didn't want to buy any clothing, or B, they wanted to buy sweatpants.
Right.
So there, that New York Times article that came out a couple weeks ago about how entire world, is it? Like all of a sudden we're doing amazingly well because that's what they do is they sell like clothes that are basically loungewear, like sweatpants, etc. And they did super, super well. But there were other brands that, were selling occasion dresses. And all of a sudden there's no occasion. So like what's crazy is that because things are so fast is like starting in the next couple of months, a lot of people, a lot of brands, retailers have been able to read and react in that amount of time. So we are going to start seeing a lot of like sweatpants becoming available or house dresses, things that actually have like the current state of affairs in mind.
It's true. I feel like, so basically what happened is everybody canceled everything they could on order, which we've talked about a lot on the show. I have a lot of problems with that, but that's what they did. And then they were kind of like, okay, well, let's just see of what we have, what works. And it was sweatpants and sweatshirts. Like the place I was working before I got laid off, it was a rental service. We could not rent out a sweatshirt for the life of us. We were like, we're not buying sweatshirts ever again. Suddenly that's so all anyone was renting. And so I think now every email I get from a retailer, it is all loungewear. Like they've been able to chase back into this other stuff because they were working on such a tight timeline anyway. And so now I suspect all we're going to see for the coming months is sweatpants until there's some sort of clear light at the end of the tunnel, which is just not there. So I think this is a really good time to change your shopping behavior.
It's like a reset button.
It is. It is. How many sweatpants do you need? You don't. So if you want beautiful special things, this is your time to like buy secondhand and buy vintage or make your own and like stop buying tons of new clothes because like there's only so many sweatpants that one person should have. And I have this incredible fear that when this is all over, we're just going to see mountains of sweatpants at the thrift store.
God, you're so right.
It's
and
gross.
What's interesting is like, I feel like you said, when we do finally see this light at the end of the tunnel, I hope and I think, and I've read and heard from different things that things will maybe move into a period where everyone's going to be so excited that they can kind of like go outside and not wear sweatpants. That like, my hope is that people are going to be like, I want to just dress the way I want to dress. I don't want to care about what other people think.
Yeah.
This is my opportunity. Like, again, reset button. I just want to be me, be unique. And I hope that means that people will not see the appeal in these fast fashion companies where everything looks the same. And they'll just want to invest in like special pieces that are either vintage or made by hand from someone. Actually, I was at the beginning of the pandemic, I was, watching all of these like business of fashion Zoom interviews with like Marc Jacobs, Anna Sui, etc. And Anna Sui said something really interesting, and she was like my idol growing up. Like her and Marc Jacobs, actually, they're like the reasons why I wanted to become a fashion designer. And she was saying how when there's been this kind of recession / social unrest in society in the past, like for example, in like the late 60s, early 70s, what emerged was a lot of like craft, like people making things with their hand and an appreciation for things that take time and are special and unique. And I'm really starting to feel that happen. And I hope that it's not just like a moment in time. I hope that it's a real kind of revolution. But obviously, like we said before, like you get into this kind of bubble and you don't really realize that, you're just in the bubble and you're not seeing the scope outside of it is that people are still like buying clothing from fast fashion in masses and discarding it. So, I'm hopeful that this bubble is starting to grow.
That's my hope too. But yeah, like you and I were talking about, it seems like to us, everyone's making their own stuff and buying vintage and secondhand and saying no to fast fashion, right? And then I'm like, look at, I don't know, like a Fashion Nova post and there's like 10,000 comments on it. And I'm like, oh God.
And
every time I see
saying
a positive comment,
pay up. They're being like, I love that. I want it. Add to cart.
Yeah, and like tagging their friends and like, we need to get this. And I mean, that can go for every fast fashion brand that's out there right now. Like, it's so infuriating. Sometimes I like to just like creep on different brands who I know haven't paid up yet and see how many people are calling them out on social media, and I'll get really excited because I'll see like a steady flow of it. And then there'll be someone who's like, oh my God, I'm obsessed with this. And I'm like, no, stop. Put your wallet away.
Exactly.
Oh God. So anyway, yeah, I do think like we all need to continue to like speak up as loudly as possible.
Absolutely. Yes.
If every one person who gets it will spread it to another person. It's just like, coronavirus, but in a good way. Like, I do love the idea of this like transformative period coming after this. And I said this the other day to one of my friends that if you don't feel like you have been changed by what's been going on in the world right now, then you live some incredible life of privilege
100%.
that I don't even want to know you. I can't. Like, I need to be surrounded by people who feel what's happening and feel how it has changed them.
And are feeling inspired by it too. Like, not just seeing the negatives, but seeing the potential for positive change out of this.
Which I think is there. Even when we talk about the recession, which you and I were both kind of in the early parts of our careers then, when I think about the recession, it kind of didn't affect me because I was so low level in my career that no one was going to lay me off because they were practically getting my work for free.
True.
Ironically, I will just say this. When the recession hit, I was like, I'm going to lose my job. Like, no one's going to buy all these teenager clothes, right? So I'm going to pay off my student loans. And then when I get laid off, I won't have any debt. And I'm going to go live in Mexico City and write a book. And I'm never going to work in fashion again. And so this was like, what, 2008? And so I ate ramen and paid off my student loans. And I never got laid off.
Well, that's amazing.
And I continued to work. But now I remember my mom telling me, you're not getting laid off. Your work is practically free. And I was like, no, don't say that. And I think back, like, what if I had gotten laid off? What would my life be now? Like, I'd be on this totally different journey.
So true.
So I know. And I'm like, so really, like, more than 10 years ago, I already was like, the fashion industry is bullshit. But I still stuck it out and kept doing it.
We all do, because honestly, because of this kind of underlying feeling, like I mentioned earlier, that like someone else will do it if you don't. So like by leaving, even if you had left at your own accord, nothing's going to change. Like you're not changing anything by leaving. You're not like having this profound impact by being like, I'm out of here, mic drop, done with fast fashion. It's like, cool, it's going on without you.
Totally. So like my best example of that is I worked for a startup for several years and I worked really, really hard. I built this really huge private label business for them and it was really stressful and I didn't have health insurance and it was a small team and the environment was super toxic and it wasn't in line at all with the external facing culture, like what customers were seeing. And over time that sort of chipped away at me. Like I would go to trade shows and people would be like, oh my God, I'm so obsessed with your brand. You're so lucky to work there and stuff like that. And I would have to be like, yeah, I'm so lucky. Wow.
But that was even my reaction when you told me about this brand.
I know. And it was, meanwhile, like I was like getting a stomach ulcer because it was so stressful and the CEO was so abusive and there was just so much other like fucked up shit going on there all the time. And there was this part of me that thought like when I left that it would just get better somehow, that maybe me leaving would change things. But you know what? They just brought in someone else who was way more of an asshole than me and it got worse.
Yeah.
And I hear stories from people who've worked there since then and I feel I don't know, like kind of guilty almost that like I could have stayed and tried to change it. It was never going to change.
But you know that that's not true.
Yeah, exactly. And so it goes back to illustrate what you're saying is like you leave this dumb industry and someone else is going to step right in and do your job and nothing is going to change. Yeah. So I do think it's like the world is forcing everybody to make changes right now. And I do believe that this is a time when we can upset the status quo and do things better and get more people in on it, you know, stop buying garbage clothes that we wear one time. Hey, it's Amanda again. I can't wait for our next episode with Dani. Talking to her was so much fun. I'm excited to have 2 more episodes of Dani to edit. I was going to share a Dear Amanda letter today, but then I realized that most of the messages I received all had basically the same question, and it relates to #PayUp, which is something we've been talking about a lot here on the pod, but it's kind of also all over social media right now. So the question is, how can retailers legally cancel orders on factories and vendors just because of COVID? Like, why aren't they being sued for breach of contract or just being jerks, right? So I'm going to answer that question right now. And rather than reading one of the letters, I'm just addressing all of you. And I'm also saying, hey, thank you so much for reaching out and asking me about it. Let's get into it. Okay, so most retailers, I mean, really anyone who is bigger than a single boutique, will generally ask vendors to sign a vendor manual or vendor agreement before they issue their first order with that vendor or factory, whatever you want to call it. And a vendor manual contains a lot of information. I mean, it's depending on the retailer, it can be super duper granular. So like how orders should be packaged, how the boxes should be labeled, the kinds and sizes of boxes that are used, how or if they should have price tickets applied, if brands' own hang tags are allowed, you know, how the orders should be shipped, when the orders should be shipped, what happens if an order is late or too many units short or over, that kind of thing. I mean, it literally is a handbook of like how the vendor must fulfill the orders. And it can, like I said, be super detailed. There are even weight limits per box. For bigger retailers, it can be hundreds of pages long, and it's kind of being continuously updated to adapt to changes within their own business practices. For smaller retailers, it might just be a few pages, or even like I've worked places where the vendor agreement was just one page that was tacked on to the end of each purchase order. As a reminder, I don't know if I've talked about this before, so it might not even be a reminder, but a purchase order, what we call in the industry a PO, is an order that's sent to the vendor for, what the buyer's ordering. It's an order, right? So if a vendor signs the manual, which is kind of non-negotiable, basically they have to, before they're going to receive any POs, they have to agree to everything in the manual. Now, some big brands like Levi's or Nike, like brands that might be bigger than the actual retailer or just as big, because all of this vendor retailer relationship is based on power. The bigger guy is always going to have the upper hand here. So these bigger brands will push back and they'll sort of cross out the things they don't agree to. And that would happen a lot with these larger brands. And we would just generally talk to our operations team to confirm these exceptions and then move on with the order. Because if you're not bigger than Levi's, how are you going to argue with them? And you want those Levi's because your customer wants them, right? But when I worked at a much smaller startup, I could barely get anyone to sign the full vendor manual because just about every brand was bigger than us. So these vendor manuals also include a schedule of chargebacks, and chargebacks are the sort of fines that vendors receive for not adhering to the manual. And that can mean like, hey, you shipped without labeling the box correctly. Okay, well, that's going to cost you $150. So we are going to deduct $150 from the invoice you're going to send us for that order. Did you forget to apply the price tickets? Well, that could be $500 or more that we're going to charge you back. Did you ship 100 extra units? That's another chargeback, and so on. Generally, the buyer's not making that decision. The warehouse is going to make that decision, and they're going to send that to accounts payable, and accounts payable is going to deduct that from the payment. That can be really hard if you're a small brand and maybe you were only shipping $1,000 worth of stuff to the retailer in the first place, and now you're getting a chargeback for $100 or $500. That can be really devastating. But once again, this is all about that sort of power play, like who's bigger, who gets to call the shots. Now, as a buyer, if a vendor reached out to me and was like, listen, this is really unfair, or I don't have the spare cash to lose $150 for a chargeback, I would generally jump in and be like, hey, let's just call this a warning. Let's make sure this never happens again. Please don't charge them back. But once again, it's relationships here. These relationships are super important. Another thing the vendor manuals include is a lot of legal language, and this can kind of depend on the retailer. Some might say, hey, if we find out that you sold us a knockoff, you will be legally responsible from the lawsuit from that affected designer. Or if someone is injured by the stuff you sold us, you'll be liable. Those kinds of things. Most importantly, a majority of these vendor manuals, like basically if anyone there is doing their job right, they're going to include legal language around cancellations. In most of these agreements, a buyer can cancel the order if it's even 1 day late. This due date for the order is called the cancel date because, well, the order can be canceled if it doesn't arrive by then. And other companies say the cancel date is the last day the order can be shipped or it will be canceled. Basically, there's a lot of rules around timely delivery that can lead to cancellation. Now, buyers rarely cancel because something is late. Usually we're going to negotiate a discount, about 1% to 2% per day that it's late. And that kind of depends on the vendor and the buyer. Or maybe we will reduce the size of the order. Like maybe instead of the 1,000 units on the order, we'll only accept 800. A lot of negotiations happen here because this relationship is really important. And if you're a decent buyer, then you want to preserve this relationship by not totally fucking over the vendor. But a lot of orders are running late all the time. Like I would say at least half, maybe even more, depending on a lot of different external factors. So you want there to be some repercussions so this vendor doesn't ship every single order late from now on. Because a lot of people depend on this order arriving on time. Store merchandising plans, sales events, and marketing launches depend on the product arriving when it was supposed to. A late PO can affect a lot of different people and just general business To be honest, I've had vendors who were always late, always sort of exploited my kindness, and I eventually had to drop the hammer on them by canceling an order. But once again, very, very rare. So another part of this legal language is the force majeure clause. And you might have seen this mentioned with #PayUp, but do you know what it means? Well, here's a pretty straightforward definition. Force majeure is usually taken to mean the occurrence of an event outside the control of two parties that prevents one or both sides from fulfilling the contract. It is a provision often found in commercial contracts, so not just retailers buying from vendors. Like you can find this in a contract for a wedding, or any sort of other events like buying tickets for a show. Basically any agreement between two businesses. War, strike, and riot are often listed in a force majeure clause, and their meanings are really clear. The force majeure clause can also include natural disasters, and that's kind of on both sides of it. So like if there is a crazy typhoon and all the Southeast Asian vendors can't ship on time, they might want to cancel the order because they can't fulfill their end of the contract. Conversely, if a company's headquarters are in California and there's a crazy earthquake, they might want to cancel their orders. So we're starting to look at things that are sort of outside of the control of the retailer and the vendor, or in the case of any other commercial contract, just the people on both sides of it. So I would suspect the next version of everyone's vendor manual will have pandemic added to the list. This is something none of us had really thought of before. This force majeure clause allows retailers to legally cancel orders on factories and vendors due to COVID. This kind of language also allowed places like Ross to inform their vendors that they would now be paying the vendors in 3 months instead of 1. Does that mean it's okay? Not necessarily. Once again, canceling on a vendor is normally pretty rare unless you work for a pretty unethical company. These things happen. When you cancel on a vendor, the factory owners don't get paid, the factory workers don't get paid, the fabric mill doesn't get paid, the fabric mill workers don't get paid, and so on. None of these workers have savings to fall back on. So people go hungry. They get sick and they can't afford to see a doctor. More than 3/4 of overseas garment workers are women. Their jobs, while still keeping them below the poverty level, actually give them a certain level of agency that they wouldn't have otherwise. Without those wages, they are incredibly vulnerable to physical and sexual abuse, like even more than usual. So this is a full-on humanitarian issue. So once again, much like knockoffs that we were talking about earlier in the episode, the law doesn't really protect the ethical right thing. It's merely the legal right thing. So there's a big difference between the law and ethics when we talk about force majeure and COVID cancellations. Some retailers have given into public pressure and they've paid their factories. And this includes Gap, H&M, Zara, and Levi's. And by the way, Zara had originally canceled more than $100 million worth of orders. So that is a big win. But many other retailers haven't paid yet. And I don't want to be cynical, but it's looking less and less likely that they will. Meanwhile, many of them have posted a profit for the second quarter of this year, so that's May through July, when all of these orders were canceled, and they're even paying dividends to shareholders. You can see the full list at remake.world, and I'll share the link with you in the show notes. It is so important that we continue to put pressure on these retailers to #PayUp. It's ridiculous that we have to pressure these corporations to do the right thing. But I think that it says something about the fashion industry as a whole. If we don't monitor them closely, they will do whatever they want. Ethics are not a concern to them unless they risk losing our money. Profits over people. I know that's dark, but that's the current policy of the fashion industry. Long term, these brands need to die. They need to be replaced by people who are doing things the right way, people who recognize that all of the humans making the clothing they sell are just that, humans, with needs and wants, with just as much of a right to happiness, health, and security as the executives back in the corporate office. And that's never going to happen without us. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Every purchase we make is political. And our money is as powerful as our vote. Let's continue to vote for a better future. Thanks for listening to another episode of Clotheshorse. All of your feedback and support keeps me going in an otherwise pretty weird time. So thank you for leaving positive reviews and sharing our content on Instagram. If you like what you're hearing and you haven't done it yet, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I don't know, you might even consider subscribing, so, you'll never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at Clotheshorse Podcast. My current post aesthetic is primarily very Laura Ashley and #PrairieCore, but who knows what I'll be into next week. Do you have questions? Need advice? Want to give me some feedback? Or, if you have an idea for an episode, I would love to hear it. Please reach out via email at clotheshorsepodcast@gmail.com. I love hearing from all of you. It's the best thing ever. You can also just DM me on Instagram. That's pretty cool too. Thanks as always to Dustin Travis White for our awesome theme music and frequent audio support. Bye.